In class, we've been working on committing to memory the conversions among the most common fractions, decimals, and percents. But we're going to take a step back and look at how to do this in general. First of all, let's look about converting percents to decimals. And I want you to think about two things here. I want you to remember that percent by definition means per 100. So 43% is really the same thing as 43 out of 100. The fraction bar also means divided by, and as we've been working on as well, realizing when we divide by a power of 10, we move the decimal point to the left for the same number of places as we have zeros. So we might not see the decimal point in 43, but it's right there. And if I divide by 100, I'm moving the decimal point to the left. Also, though, remember, if you say this out loud, it is 43 hundredths. And we write that as a decimal point with 43, and since it has two places, that makes it 43 hundredths. So if I have something that's more than that, if I have, or something like this, like 0.09%, this actually, as a decimal, is, I'm moving it over two places to the left. That makes it 0.0009, or 9/10,000ths. If I have 250%, it moves two places to the left, and that makes it the number 2.5, which makes sense because this is 100% is the whole thing, 200% is twice, and 250 is 2.5 times. So, I guess I'm out. To convert from a percent to a decimal, you move the decimal point, move the decimal point two places to the left. To the left. And that's the thing that can be a little bit confusing, but if you think of percent as divided by, out of 100, that's your little cue that you're dividing, and so it moves to the left. Well, it's not a hard stretch to guess that to go from a decimal then to a percent. This stylus is not working well. Decimal to a percent is the opposite. You're going to move it two places to the right. And here's why. Not just because it's the reverse. Move the decimal point to the right. Of course that makes sense because it's the opposite, but here is another way of thinking about it. If I give you this number, we've been practicing reading decimals as we do our conversions. If I say this number, you know that the way we read that is 52 hundredths. And of course, out of 100 is percent. So it stands to reason that 52 hundredths is 52%. In fact, if I'm looking at decimal places, the first two, this one is tenths, this one is hundredths. So whatever is here is the percent, and then the decimal point will remain. What that looks like is different. If I say this. Now, I read it 7/100ths. So 7 out of 100 is 7%. I'm moving it 2 places to the right. What if it were, I don't know, 0.6? We know that's 6/10, but I need to know what it is as a percent. And since the first 2 decimal places are hundredths, I need to put a 0 in here. 6/10, you know, it clearly is the equivalent fraction of 60 out of 100, which makes it 60%. Again, you're moving the decimal point 2 places to the right. Okay, what if it's, though, 0.007? That's 7/1000ths. That's less than even 1%. So what that makes this, when I move my decimal point 2 places to the right, is 0.7%, or 7/10ths of 1%. If I say 150%, sorry, that's not what I want to say. I'm distracted by my stylus. Come on. Let's not do that. We're going to say 1.5. That means, as a number, this is 1.5 of something. As a percent, that would be 150%. It's more than 100% because the number is more than 1, making the whole percent more than 150%. So the whole idea of fractions to decimals, decimals to percents and percents to decimals is important. It's just, you should understand the concept of which way it goes, but you might want to think of it like this. Here's D and here's P. D comes before P in the alphabet. So if I'm going from a decimal to a percent, I move to the right. If I'm going from a percent to a decimal, I move to the left. For those of you who need some sort of memorizing tool, that can sometimes help. So now we have to look at when I'm going from a decimal to a fraction and a fraction to a decimal. There are, once we can get into decimals from fractions, you can use that, the one I talked about before, about going to a percent. So if I want to go from a fraction to a decimal, what you really need to remember is that the fraction bar means divided by. So we know from our work that we've been doing that 5/8 as a decimal is 0.625, and since I already know how to get to a percent, that makes it 62.5%. If you happen to forget this, because the fraction bar means divided by, in a calculator you can say 5 divided by 8, and your calculator will give you the handy result, of 0.625. And from there, because we know how to go to percent, we can see that. So if I say, sometimes actually there are shortcuts too. If I say 7/20ths, I could do this in a calculator, 20ths. But also, you should use your common sense as well. 7 out of 20 is 35 out of 100, which makes it, as a decimal, 0.35, and as a percent, 35%, 35/100ths. Fraction to a decimal, it's easy when you remember that the fraction bar means divided by. Fraction is also quite simple, really. Decimal to a fraction, as we've been working on with our flashcards, you can read a decimal and hear the fraction. If I say to you, pretend you didn't know this one already, 0.75, if you read that to me, you can hear that it's 75 hundredths, and then reduced, that is 3/4. So simply stated, you read it, write it, and reduce it. Always, as much as you can memorize, it will help you. And looking for shortcuts is helpful. But in general, if you have these skills, you should be able to go back and forth among the different forms of the same numbers, decimals, fractions, and percents.